They scrapped everything he'd spent 4 years of his life perfecting. 8 prototype turbine assemblies, once the centerpiece of a defense contractor's most ambitious propulsion program, hauled across 3 provinces on a flatbed and dumped at the loading bay of a one-man repair shop in a town most maps didn't bother labeling. To the 31-year-old heiress who'd initialed the write-off, without a second glance, they were dead weight on a quarterly balance sheet. Failed hardware, expensive embarrassment. But the man who knelt on the cracked concrete and pressed his palm flat against the housing of the first unit, he didn't see scrap. He saw his own fingerprints. He saw the best work he'd ever done, staring back at him from inside a shipping crate that smelled like diesel and neglect. If you want to know what happens when one man's stubbornness goes up against a corporation built on lies, stay until the end. Hit that like button and tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The truck showed up on a Wednesday. Garrett Novak had been underneath a Ford half-ton belonging to a rancher named Doug, who owed him for 2 previous jobs, and would almost certainly owe him for this one too, when the air brakes hit. That long, exhausted hiss of something enormous coming to rest in a place it had no business being. He slid out from under the truck, wiped his hands on a rag that had stopped being useful for wiping anything about 6 months ago, and walked to the front of the shop, squinting against the flat October light. The rig was massive, full commercial transport, the kind that normally blew past Briar Creek on the Trans-Canada without slowing down. No logo, plain white trailer. A driver who climbed down from the cab looking like he'd drawn the short straw on route assignments and was making peace with it poorly. "Novak's Mechanical?" The driver called, checking a clipboard. "That's what the sign says." The driver looked up. He took in Garrett, the steel-toed boots worn soft at the toe, the flannel with a rip along the shoulder seam, the ball cap pushed back on dark hair that hadn't seen a barber in longer than it should have, and something moved across his face. Not contempt, just the particular surprise of a person who'd expected a bigger operation at the other end of his delivery manifest. "Got 8 units for you, industrial freight. They're heavy, so I'll get the forklift," Garrett said, and didn't wait for the man to finish. It took most of an hour. The crates came out one at a time, bolted shut, each one stenciled with a serial designation Garrett didn't recognize, but somehow felt he should. They were dented. One had a fracture along the bottom rail that said it had been dropped by someone who didn't think the contents mattered. He signed the delivery form. The driver handed over a thin envelope and was already walking back to the cab before Garrett had read the first line. "Property disposal, Ashford Dynamics Corporation. Recipient, Novak's Mechanical. Briar Creek. On contents, 8X prototype turbine assemblies, Griffin series. Condition, damaged, non-functional. Disposal classification, commercial discard." Garrett read it twice. Then he stood very still in the cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Ashford Dynamics. He hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in 5 years. He'd seen it occasionally, the side of a transit bus in Toronto, a sponsorship banner, during a hockey broadcast he'd changed the channel away from. But seeing it printed on official paper, connected to a delivery that had just arrived at his door, felt different. It felt like being punched in the sternum by someone he thought had stopped swinging. He folded the paper into his back pocket. He walked to the first crate, found a pry bar, and got to work. The first unit was in worse shape than the paperwork suggested. Fractured exhaust manifold. 2 injector housings cracked clean through, impact damage, not wear. Wiring harness melted in 2 places. And the main rotor assembly had been removed entirely, which struck Garrett as strange enough that he crouched there for a full minute thinking about why someone would strip a single component from hardware they intended to throw away. Then his thumb found it, a marking along the seam where 2 sections of housing met. Small, partially ground down, deliberately, but not completely. 3 letters pressed into metal with a hand tool he'd made himself from a modified dental pick he'd bought at a surplus sale in Peterborough 11 years ago. GAN, Garrett Andrew Novak. He sat back on his heels and looked at the turbine for a long time. He was 34. He didn't look like much. Medium height, lean from work rather than intention, hands permanently mapped with small scars and stains that soap couldn't reach. He had the kind of eyes that stayed on things a beat too long, as though he was always measuring something nobody else could see. A man he'd once respected enormously had told him that his greatest quality was that he noticed what other people missed. He wondered what that man would think of him now, crouched on the floor of a repair shop in rural Ontario, looking at a turbine that had been classified as garbage. He stood, rolled his shoulders, looked at all 8 crates. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what they did to you." Tessa came through the shop door at 3:52, which was 4 minutes later than usual, which Garrett noticed because he noticed everything about his daughter's schedule, the way other men tracked stock prices or playoff standings. She dropped her backpack with a thud that rattled the framed photo on the wall, the one of her as a baby, the only photo in the house he refused to move regardless of her opinions, and appeared in the doorway still wearing her jacket half off one shoulder. "Dad, there's a bunch of weird crates out back." "I know. Are those engines?" "Turbines." Similar idea. She came further in, stepping around his toolbox with the automatic precision of a child who'd grown up navigating this particular obstacle course. She was 9, with her mother's sharp, dark eyes and Garrett's stubbornness, a combination that made raising her simultaneously exhausting and the only thing keeping him upright most days. She stopped next to him, looked at the open crate. "That one's broken." "It is. Can you fix it?" He considered the question the way he considered all of her questions, not as something to be dismissed, but as something that deserved actual thought. "Yeah," he said. "I think I can. You're doing the quiet thing again." "What quiet thing?" "Where you go quiet because something's a big deal, but you don't want it to be a big deal." He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was uncomfortably perceptive for a 9-year-old. "Go do your homework." "I did it on the bus." "Do it again. More carefully." She gave him a look that said she saw directly through him, which she probably did, grabbed an apple from the mini-fridge in the corner, and retreated toward the house. "Mrs. Pelletier says hi," she called back. "Also, your oil change coupon expired. The coupon is still valid. You're going to lose money. Tell Mrs. Pelletier the coupon is still valid." He heard her laugh as the door swung shut, and then he was alone again with 8 turbines and 3 pressed initials and the name Ashford Dynamics on official paper. He reached for his notebook, a beat-up composition book he kept for technical notes, opened it to a blank page and wrote at the top, "Griffin Unit 1. Below that, start from the beginning. He'd been 17 when he fell in love with turbines. Not cars, not planes. Turbines. The distinction mattered. A turbine was a problem with hundreds of moving parts, each dependent on every other, each capable of being the single element that made everything else fail. Getting one right meant understanding mechanics, thermodynamics, material science, and the specific unforgiving relationship between heat and metal under extreme stress. His father had run a garage in Timmins. Not remarkable, just reliable. The kind of man who kept the town's trucks running and came home smelling like oil. Garrett had spent his teens in that shop, rebuilt his first engine at 16, started improving designs at 18, which was also the year a man named Frank Haldane had driven through town with a seized alternator and ended up spending 5 hours watching Garrett work and asking questions about propulsion engineering that most university graduates couldn't have answered. Frank had given him a card. "When you're ready," he'd said. Garrett had called 3 years later, 2 years of night courses at Cambrian College, 1 year of saving money in a coffee can under his bed. He'd driven 7 hours to an interview in a dress shirt he'd ironed twice and answered every technical question with the kind of specificity that made Frank lean back in his chair and say, "You understand things, Garrett. That's rarer than people realize." Frank Haldane had been the chief engineer at Ashford Dynamics. He'd brought Garrett in, mentored him, shielded him through the politics of a large corporation that didn't always welcome a kid from Timmins who asked too many pointed questions and moved too fast. He'd been the reason Garrett eventually led the team that developed the Griffin turbine, a project that consumed 4 years of his life, produced 8 prototype units, and was the finest work he'd ever done. It had also been the project that was running when everything collapsed. He didn't let himself think about that part. Not tonight. Too much work, and thinking about it made his hands unsteady, and unsteady hands had no business near precision machinery. He stayed in the shop until 11 cataloging damage on the first unit. When he went inside, Tessa was asleep on the couch with a book open on her chest. Standard procedure when she claimed to have gone to bed at the time he'd asked. He marked her page, set the book on the coffee table, and carried her to her room. She was getting too big for this. Another year, maybe two, and it would be awkward. He didn't think about that either. He tucked her in. She murmured something that was almost a word, but not quite. "I know," he said, even though she hadn't said anything. He went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about 8 turbines and 3 pressed initials and what it meant that someone had tried to grind them away and failed because the marks went deeper than they'd bothered to check. The offices of Ashford Dynamics occupied 14 floors of a glass tower on Bay Street in Toronto. And on any given Thursday morning, the executive floor smelled like fresh espresso and controlled anxiety. Ingrid Ashford moved through it like she'd been built for it, which in many ways she had. 31, dark-haired, with the kind of posture that people read as confidence, but was actually the physical result of her father saying, "Stand straight, Ingrid. People judge you before you speak," for most of her adolescence. She wore a charcoal blazer, practical heels expensive enough to be taken seriously but sensible enough for 12-hour days, and an expression her assistant Jerome privately described as 3 moves ahead and waiting to see if anyone catches up. She'd been running the company for 16 months since her father, Bernard Ashford, had died of a stroke in his office on a Thursday afternoon. He'd been 63. He'd been on a call with a supplier in Munich. He'd been, by all accounts, fine until he wasn't. She'd handled the funeral, the estate, the board's sudden pointed interest in whether she was capable. Then she'd gone home one night, sat on the bathroom floor for an hour, gotten up, and kept going. She did not have the luxury of falling apart. She'd known that her entire life. "The disposal is confirmed," Jerome said, appearing at her shoulder. 8 Griffin units delivered to a small shop in Briar Creek, rural Ontario, about 3 hours northeast. "Fine," Ingrid said without looking at the tablet. "Tell legal the liability transfer is finalized." She had exactly one thought about a single proprietor repair shop in rural Ontario. They'd strip the units for parts, and that would be the end of it. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about several things, but she didn't know it yet. On the 17th day after the delivery, Garrett's phone rang at 7:15 in the morning. A woman's voice, professional, clipped, controlled. "This is Ingrid Ashford, CEO of Ashford Dynamics. I believe you received a disposal delivery from us approximately 2.5 weeks ago." "I did. I'd like to stop in and inspect the disposal units. Verify the transfer documentation. Friday afternoon, 2 o'clock. You want to come and look at your garbage." A pause. "Excuse me? That's the disposal classification on the paperwork. Commercial discard. Those turbines were classified as garbage." He set his coffee down. "But yes, you're welcome to inspect them. I'll be here." She arrived at 1:47 on Friday, 13 minutes early, in a car that cost more than his shop earned in 2 years. She was alone, which surprised him. She stepped out and looked at the shop the way people looked at places that were smaller than they'd expected. Not contempt, recalibration. Then she looked at Garrett, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Mr. Novak." "Miss Ashford." He showed her the first turbine, explained the damage, the repairs, the specific design architecture that made the Griffin series unique. He spoke quickly and precisely, in the vocabulary of someone who'd lived with these technical details for years. He pointed out the fuel delivery modifications he'd made, the revised thermal regulation loop, the adjustment to the intake geometry he'd been mentally drafting for years and had now finally implemented. Ingrid said nothing through most of it. When he finished, she was quiet. "Where did you learn this level of technical knowledge?" "I'm a mechanic in a small town," he said. "Where do you think I learned it?" She met his eyes. "I think somewhere more specific than that." "Come back in 3 weeks," he said. "When the first unit is ready for a full test, I'll show you." She looked at him for another beat. Then she nodded once. She drove back toward Toronto in silence and pulled off at a rest stop 40 minutes outside the city and called Jerome. "I need the complete file on the Griffin program. Not the summary, the complete file. Engineering reports, personnel records, budget documentation, performance trial results. Everything. That's going to be a significant volume of material." "I'm the CEO, Jerome. I am the authorization. Monday morning." The files arrived in 3 boxes and a supplemental drive. By 6 that evening, she'd found 7 things that didn't add up. By 9, she'd found 11. By midnight, her legal pad was dense with notes in handwriting that got smaller and tighter, the harder she concentrated. The Griffin turbines hadn't failed the performance trials. Not exactly. They'd failed a specific set of parameters under a testing protocol that had been changed, quietly, 6 weeks before the trials, from the original protocol. The change was buried in a single line of a procedural document filed under a category that bore no obvious connection to the Griffin program. She sat with that for a long time. Then she looked at the personnel records. The Griffin team's lead engineer had been scrubbed from every internal document. Not reassigned, scrubbed. The name replaced in every instance with lead engineer. Position terminated, reference restricted. She went through 4 files before she found a cross-reference someone had missed. A safety certification in a regulatory archive maintained separately from the company's internal systems. Garrett A. Novak, lead engineer, Griffin Propulsion Development Program. She'd driven to Briar Creek to verify a disposal. She'd stood in a small shop and watched a man explain the architecture of those turbines with the fluency of someone who'd designed them, because he had designed them. They met at the diner on Main Street in Briar Creek on a Thursday morning. The place was called Maggie's, though no one named Maggie had been involved with it since the early 90s. Red vinyl booths, coffee in cups heavy enough to be classified as blunt instruments. Ingrid set a folder on the table. Your name was removed from every internal record associated with the Griffin program. Personnel files, engineering reports, patent applications. Someone processed a formal administrative action to erase your involvement. Garrett wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I suspected. I didn't have access to confirm it. Who authorized it? In the records you found. The authorization chain traces to a single executive sphere. She paused. Marcus Thorne. Garrett's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. Marcus Thorne had been the chief operating officer for 12 years. Silver-haired, polished, possessed of the kind of boardroom authority that institutions produce and reward. For the 4 years Garrett had worked inside the company, Thorne had been the single most consistent obstacle to everything Garrett tried to do. He'd smiled at him in meetings, called him son, in a way that was paternal on the surface and condescending underneath, praised his work to his face. And then, Garrett had later discovered, systematically ensured that credit for that work was diffused across teams rather than attributed to any individual, particularly an individual named Garrett Novak, who had no corporate pedigree, no wealthy connections, and had arrived from a garage in Timmins. When Jenna got sick, Garrett had applied for a medical hardship advance, a provision in his contract. Thorne had denied it through a procedural objection. Garrett had escalated. Thorne had delayed the process through successive administrative deferrals for 8 months, by which point Jenna had been through 2 rounds of treatment, and Garrett had spent everything he had and borrowed from everyone who would lend. He'd filed a formal complaint. 3 weeks later, he'd been called into a meeting and told his position was being restructured. His separation agreement included a non-disclosure provision he'd signed because he had a sick wife and a 4-year-old daughter, and no money, and a lawyer who told him fighting would take 2 years and cost more than it would recover. He'd signed it, driven home, sat in the car outside his apartment for 20 minutes, then gone inside and made dinner for Tessa because she was 4 and needed dinner, and the world hadn't stopped requiring things of him. Your wife, Ingrid said carefully. Jenna, she died 9 months after I left the company. She might have had better options if I'd had access to the compensation I was owed. He paused. I don't know that for certain, but I've had a long time to think about the possibility. Ingrid was quiet. Something moved across her face that wasn't pity, something more complicated. Reckoning. I'm sorry, she said, and it came out without the professional coding her words usually carried. Just human. Thank you. Then she told him the rest. The testing protocol had been modified by Thorne's department to set thresholds the turbines couldn't meet, deliberately, to guarantee failure. There was a competing program, an outside vendor Thorne had an undisclosed financial stake in. If the Griffin succeeded, that vendor's contract would have been terminated. If it failed, Thorne's arrangement continued. It's a theory, Garrett said. I've never had documentation to prove it. I might, Ingrid said quietly. There's a procurement subsidiary that's been operating for 7 years with unusual margins. The paper trail is interesting. And then she showed him something else. A document found in her father's private files, written 3 months before he died. Bernard Ashford had found the truth. The financial irregularities, the testing protocol change, what had been done to Garrett. He'd been building a case. He hadn't finished it. At the end, in a section shorter and less formal than the rest, Bernard had written, "Garrett Novak built the finest engineering work this company has ever produced. What was done to him was not done in my name or with my knowledge, and it will not stand uncorrected. He deserved better from us." Garrett read that paragraph twice, closed the folder, sat quietly with his hands on his knees. He was going to fix it, he said. Yes. And he ran out of time. Yes. He sat with that. It didn't undo 5 years. Didn't bring Jenna back or give Tessa a different version of those years. But it was something, knowing that the man he'd respected hadn't been the author of what happened to him. The test happened on a Saturday at an independent facility north of Barrie. Garrett drove the first restored turbine up himself, strapped into the truck bed, with 4 times the restraints a normal person would use. A technician named Stan met him at the loading dock, and together they mounted the unit to the dynamometer. Ingrid arrived at 8. She dressed down, dark pants, a sweater, no corporate armor. At 10:20, Stan straightened up from the monitoring station. "We're set. Your call." Garrett walked to the turbine, ran one final check, pressed his fingers against the housing one last time. Start sequence. The turbine turned over. It caught. And it ran, not roughly, not tentatively, but with the full, even, deeply authoritative voice of something that had been correctly built and was doing exactly what it was designed to do. The monitors lit up. The numbers matched. Not approximately, not close enough, matched. The modifications he'd implemented during restoration showed exactly the improvement he'd expected. 16% above original projected output. He became aware that Ingrid was standing beside him, both of them looking at the monitors. "Is that?" she started. 16% above spec, Garrett said. "The thermal regulation redesign. I had time to think about it. 5 years of time. You improved the design. I had nothing but time and stubbornness." Something like that. They ran the full protocol. Every test confirmed what the first run had shown. By 1 o'clock, the bay was quiet, and Garrett sat on a metal chair against the wall, feeling completely hollow in the way that sometimes follows the resolution of something you've been braced against for years. He wasn't sure if it was relief or grief or some combination without a clean name. Ingrid sat down next to him, not across from him, next to him. A choice. "My father was right about you," she said. "He was right about the turbines. I was just the one who built them." That's the same thing. He didn't argue. He was too tired, and he thought she might be right. 3 weeks later, Garrett had all 8 units restored. Dennis Burgess, a retired Ashford engineer Ingrid had connected him with, a 62-year-old who'd been restoring snowmobiles in his garage outside Gravenhurst and treated the call like a personal gift from the universe, had worked beside him every day. They fell into rhythm immediately. Garrett intuitive, Dennis methodical. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. Tessa assessed Dennis within 20 minutes of meeting him. 2 grown kids, coffee black, once rebuilt a 1974 Bombardier from wreckage, thought the school's approach to teaching fractions was fundamentally wrong. Dennis looked mildly dazed afterward. "Your daughter," Dennis said later. "I know," Garrett said. The board meeting happened on a Wednesday in the glass tower on Bay Street. 11 people around a table. Garrett sat along the wall, present, available, not at the table. He saw Thorne the moment the man walked in. 65, silver-haired, polished. Thorne glanced at Garrett the way you glance at someone you don't recognize. Maybe genuine, maybe performance. Didn't matter. Ingrid opened at 10 o'clock sharp. No preamble. Financial records first. The procurement subsidiary, the undisclosed consulting arrangement, the conflict of interest. 20 minutes of numbers and dates and authorization trails before anyone spoke. Then the testing protocol modification. That changed the room's temperature. The board understood financial irregularities in the abstract, but deliberate sabotage of an engineering program that Bernard Ashford had personally championed. That was something else. Thorne responded with measured calm, reframed the arrangement as historical, suggested non-disclosure had been inadvertent, pivoted to questioning the source material. Ingrid set Bernard Ashford's document on the table, slid copies to each board member. "This was written by my father 3 months before his death." Page 3, the room read. Garrett watched Thorne's face through the reading and saw the exact moment the man understood what he was looking at. Not a threat to manage. Something written by a dead man that couldn't be denied or buried or administratively reclassified. The composure didn't break. But it moved. What followed took 2 hours, procedural. Questions, documentation, legal counsel. A board member named Janet Kowalski asked precise, uncomfortable questions Thorne couldn't adequately answer. 2 members who'd historically sided with Thorne got progressively quieter. The vote to suspend Thorne's authority pending formal investigation was 9-2. Thorne stood with the practiced dignity of a man who'd rehearsed composure under adverse conditions, said he expected to be vindicated, left the room. The vote to restore Garrett's compensation and correct the official record was unanimous. Afterward, in the hallway, Ingrid stood next to Garrett at the window overlooking the city. "How are you?" she said. "Honest answer. I don't know yet. It's a lot to process while it's happening." "Yes, it is." Somewhere below them, the city moved with its ordinary indifference to what had just happened 17 floors above. "The investigation's going to take time," he said. "Months, maybe longer." He looked at her. She looked younger than usual, not the CEO. Just a 31-year-old woman who was very tired and wasn't sure what came next. "You did exactly what needed to be done," he said, "the way it needed to be done. My father wanted to correct this. He didn't get the time." A pause. "I got the time. You also did the work. That matters separately." Garrett drove back to Briar Creek that afternoon. 4 hours of highway with the windows cracked and the radio on a country station he didn't choose and didn't change. He stopped at the rest stop outside Barrie and called Tessa. "How was it?" she said immediately. "Good. It went the way it needed to." "Did they fire the bad guy?" "Suspended him pending investigation." "Formal version of the same thing. Did they say your name belongs on the turbines?" He paused. "Yeah, they said that. Good." The completeness of someone for whom that was the answer that mattered most. "When are you home?" "Tonight? Around 8? I'll save you dinner. It's Mrs. Pelletier's stew. Way better than mine. I know. I'll be there." The compensation was structured as a trust for Tessa's education. That was Garrett's decision, offered without inviting discussion. "The shop is fine. I'm fine. But the money that was withheld during the years her mother was sick, I want that to do something for her." The racing program was relaunched in March. The 8 Griffin turbines, Garrett's turbines, his initials pressed into each housing, were the foundation. Dennis joined the technical team full-time. Garrett consulted monthly from Briar Creek, not embedded, not relocated. He reviewed data, flagged problems, made the drive when physical presence was required. When it wasn't, he stayed home. Tessa turned 10 in December. She wanted a bonfire in the backyard, which in December in Ontario required considerably more planning than she'd accounted for, and a specific chocolate cake she'd seen in a magazine at Mrs. Pelletier's house. Ingrid came. She brought a book on aerospace engineering written for young readers that she'd researched and ordered, and Tessa received it with genuine unperformed delight that made Ingrid look quietly pleased in a way she probably didn't know was visible. The bonfire took Garrett 4 attempts. Tessa offered technical suggestions from a lawn chair wrapped in a blanket. Ingrid stood next to him during the 3rd attempt and started to say something helpful. And he said, "No," and she didn't finish. And the fire caught on the 4th try, and neither of them mentioned it. One evening in late summer, Garrett was in the shop after closing when Tessa came in with 2 mugs of tea, oversteeped, the way she always made it, and climbed onto her stool. "What are you thinking about?" "Why? You have the quiet thing again. But it's different. Before it was heavy. Now it's just like you're thinking about something real, but it's not a problem." He took the mug. Drank. "I was thinking about the morning the truck came. When I opened the first crate, whoever made the decision to send those turbines here, they thought they were getting rid of something. But it was actually the opposite," Tessa said. "Something like that." She looked at him with the direct clarity she'd been looking at him with her entire life. "Do you think things happen for a reason?" He considered it. "I think things happen," he said, "and then you decide what to do with them. The deciding is where the meaning comes from." She sat with this. Outside, the summer evening was doing its thing. Warm air, somewhere a lawnmower, the particular quality of late August light in Ontario. "That's a good answer," she said. "I've been working on it for a while." She smiled, her mother's smile, his stubbornness behind it, and drank her tea, and they sat in the comfortable quiet of the shop that was their place, in the town that was their town, as the evening settled around them without requirement or condition. The turbines were out in the world, doing what they were made to do, and the man who built them had decided that this, exactly this, was enough.